Hello everyone, and welcome back. Tonight, we begin with the story of why medieval doctors believed illness came from the stars, how learned physicians once trusted the heavens to guide their cures, and how that faith was slowly undone by doubt. Before we begin today's video, I could really use your help. We've noticed the channel's reach has dipped a little, and one of the best ways you can support us is by subscribing. It's quick, completely free, and it helps us carry on bringing you new and fascinating stories. Your support truly means the world to us, and together we can keep this channel growing. Thank you ever so much. Now, let's get on with today's story. If you enjoy these quiet journeys through history, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel, and write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. It's always fascinating to see who joins us from different corners of the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a gentle fan for a bit of background hum, and let's drift together into this night's story. I write these words in the 43rd year of the reign of our sovereign lord, King Edward III, in the autumn season, when the light grows thin and the earth prepares for its long rest. My hand shakes as it moves across the parchment, not from palsy, though I am well beyond my 60th winter, but from the weight of what I must confess. The candle beside me flickers in the draught that creeps through the shutters of this small chamber, and I wonder if the flame knows something I do not. Perhaps it remembers what I have tried so long to forget. They called me Master Physician once. They sought my counsel in the great halls and the humble cottages alike. I stood before kings and bishops with my charts of the heavens spread upon oak tables, my astrolabe gleaming in the firelight, my voice steady as I pronounced the courses of Jupiter and the malign influence of Saturn in the house of the ill. I believed, with every fibre of my being, that the stars spoke a language older than Scripture, that the movements of celestial spheres determined whether a child would wake with fever or an old man would pass quietly in his sleep. I was wrong, or perhaps I was right in ways I could not then comprehend. The truth, I have learned, is more terrible than either certainty or doubt. Would you have trusted the stars, as I once did? Would you have looked up at that vast darkness punctured by points of ancient light and believed that your fate was written there, as fixed and inevitable as the motion of the moon? I did. God forgive me, I did. I was born in the county of Oxfordshire, in a village whose name no longer matters. My father kept sheep. My mother died, bringing my younger sister into the world, a common enough passing in those days, though it carved a hollow in our house that never filled. The midwife said it was the conjunction of Mars and Saturn that did it, that such alignments brought difficulty to the womb. My father nodded and accepted this, as men accept the weather or the turning of the seasons. But I wanted to understand. Even as a boy, I would lie in the fields at night, watching the stars wheel overhead, trying to discern the pattern that had taken my mother from us. The sheep moved in the darkness like slow clouds, and the heavens turned with a grace that seemed to mock the chaos of earthly life. A travelling monk noticed me one evening, stretched out in the grass with my face turned upward. He was a Franciscan, grey-robed and lean, returning from Oxford, where he had studied under men who had studied under men who had once read the great Avicenna himself. He asked what I was looking for in the sky. The reason, I said, though I was only 12 summers old and hardly knew what I meant. He smiled, a sad smile, I remember, as though he recognized something in me that he had once carried himself. The heavens are a book, he told me. But like all books, they require a learned eye to read them properly. Would you learn that language, boy? I would. Oh, how desperately I would. My father, who had never ventured beyond the next market town, somehow found the means to send me to the monastery at Reading. I do not know what he sacrificed to make this possible. We never spoke of it. Perhaps he believed that understanding the force that had taken my mother might bring some meaning to her passing. Perhaps he simply saw that I would never be content among the sheep. The monastery library smelled of leather and old smoke and something else. A scent I later learned was the particular must that clings to vellum when it has been handled by many hands across many years. Here I encountered my first proper books, the works of Hippocrates and Galen, the canon of Avicenna, the treatises of Albumassar on astrology, and the Almagest of Ptolemy. These volumes were more precious than gold. A single page might represent a month's labour by a skilled scribe. I learned Latin. I learned to calculate the positions of the planets using tables that had been compiled in Baghdad and Toledo centuries before my birth. I learned that the human body was governed by 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and that these humours were in turn governed by the elements: air, water, fire, earth, and above all these elements, moving through the celestial spheres, were the 7 wandering stars: the Moon, Mercury, Venus, the Sun, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. Each planet ruled certain organs, certain temperaments, certain qualities of being. The Moon governed the brain and the lungs, brought forth moisture and changeability. Mars, hot and dry, inflamed the blood and brought fevers. Saturn, cold and malevolent, caused melancholy and withering. To heal a patient, one had to understand which celestial influence had disturbed the balance of their humours, and then apply the appropriate remedy at the astrologically correct moment. This was not superstition. This was science. The accumulated wisdom of Greeks and Arabs and Christians, refined over centuries of careful observation. When I read that the great physician Arnold of Villanova had cured the King of Aragon by consulting the stars, I felt a fierce pride, as though I had been admitted to a mystery that elevated man above the beasts. Could you tell a man's fate from the trembling of a flame? I believed I could learn to do far more than that. At 24 years of age, I left the monastery and travelled to Montpellier, where the most renowned medical school in Christendom trained physicians in the healing arts. The journey took 3 months. I saw the sea for the first time, that grey-green vastness that seemed to mirror the sky. And I understood why the ancients had believed the world was encompassed by water, that ocean and heaven were but 2 faces of the same eternal sphere. Montpellier was unlike anything in England. The streets were narrow and climbed steep hills. The light had a different quality, sharper and more golden. Students from every corner of Europe gathered there, Germans and Italians, Aragonese and Flemish, even a few dark-eyed scholars from the Arabic lands beyond the Pyrenees. We argued in the courtyards about the nature of fevers, the proper depth for bloodletting, the interpretation of urines, the significance of planetary aspects. My master was a man called Magister Bernardus, who had studied under the great Guy de Chauliac himself. Bernardus was small and precise, with fingers stained permanently black from the inks he used to illuminate his manuscripts. He could diagnose a fever from the colour of the tongue and the quality of the pulse, and he knew which herbs to prescribe for every imbalance of the humours. But more than this, he taught us to read the heavens as a physician reads the body. The macrocosm reflects the microcosm, he would say, standing before his great chart of correspondences. Man is a small world, and the world is a great man. What affects one must affect the other. When Mars enters Aries, the choleric man becomes quarrelsome and prone to inflammation. When the moon waxes full, wounds bleed more freely. These are not mysteries, they are laws, as fixed as geometry. I absorbed everything. I learned to cast horoscopes for patients, calculating the exact positions of the planets at the moment they fell ill. I learned which days were favourable for administering purgatives, which hours were best for bloodletting, which lunar phases would strengthen or weaken the efficacy of herbs. I learned the doctrine of signatures, that walnuts, which resembled the brain, would cure ailments of the head, and that yellow flowers would remedy jaundice. It made sense. All of it made sense. The universe was not chaos, but order, a great mechanism designed by the divine architect, and we physicians were privileged to glimpse a portion of his design. I returned to England in the 18th year of King Edward's reign, bearing my licence to practice medicine and a leather case containing my instruments: lancets for bloodletting, a urine flask for diagnosis, an astrolabe for calculating planetary positions, and several volumes copied in my own hand from the masters at Montpellier. I established myself first in Oxford, where my monastery connections served me well. The scholars there still debated whether the stars merely signified events or actively caused them, a distinction that seemed meaningless to me at the time. Whether the planets caused or merely foretold made no difference to the practical art of healing. A physician who ignored the heavens was like a sailor who refused to consult the stars for navigation. My reputation grew. I successfully treated a canon of Christchurch who had suffered from tertian fever, timing my prescriptions to coincide with favourable lunar aspects. I advised a merchant's wife on the best day for her confinement, based on the position of the moon and Jupiter, when both mother and child survived, and in those days this was far from certain. Her husband pressed 3 gold nobles into my hand and spread word of my skill throughout the city. It was this reputation that brought me to the attention of Bishop Grandisson of Exeter, who suffered from a persistent melancholy that his own physicians had failed to remedy. I was summoned to his palace in the autumn of 1343, when the leaves were turning gold and the harvest had been poor for the 2nd year running. The bishop was a learned man who had studied at Paris and who maintained an extensive library. He received me in a chamber hung with tapestries depicting the life of St. Peter, and I remember thinking that the agonies of the martyrs seemed less pronounced than the lines of suffering on his lordship's face. "They tell me you read the heavens as other men read scripture," he said, his voice heavy with fatigue. "The heavens are a scripture, your lordship," I replied, "written by the same hand that penned the sacred texts." He nodded slowly. "Then perhaps you can tell me why I am afflicted with such darkness of spirit. I pray without ceasing, I give alms, I keep the fasts, yet I wake each morning beneath a weight that no penance can lift." I cast his horoscope that very evening. Saturn, cold and melancholic, occupied his ascendant at birth and was currently in square aspect to his natal sun. The prognosis was clear: an excess of black bile, caused and continually renewed by Saturn's malign influence. I prescribed a regimen: bloodletting at specific lunar phases to reduce the black bile, a diet favouring warm and moist foods to counter Saturn's cold dryness, and certain herbs, St. John's wort and borage, to be gathered at dawn when Jupiter was rising. Additionally, I advised that he wear a sapphire ring, for sapphires channeled the beneficent influence of Jupiter and could counteract Saturn's darkness. Within 3 months the bishop's melancholy lifted. Whether this was due to my remedies, to the changing seasons, to the passage of Saturn into a more favourable position, or to some combination of all these factors, I did not know and did not question. He recovered. That was enough. The bishop was generous. More importantly, he was connected. Through his recommendation, I was invited to court, where I joined the household physicians attending upon His Majesty King Edward and his family. The royal court moved like a great caravan between Windsor, Westminster, and the king's various manors. I travelled with it, my instruments carefully packed in oiled leather, my books wrapped in wool against the rain that seemed to fall constantly in those years. Here I encountered men whose names you might know, if you have studied the chronicles. Master John of Arderne, the surgeon who could cut for the stone with remarkable success. Master Gilbert Keimer, who would later become Chancellor of Oxford, and who argued eloquently that medicine without astrology was like a body without a soul. And there were others, foreign physicians with knowledge drawn from Arabic sources, men who had studied in Salerno or Padua, and who brought with them techniques unknown in England. We debated endlessly. We disagreed on interpretations, on the precise degree of influence exerted by each planet, on whether it was permissible to cast horoscopes to predict the hour of passing, for such knowledge might interfere with God's will. But we agreed on the fundamentals: that the heavens govern the sublunary realm, that the stars were the instruments of providence, and that a physician who ignored their testimony was practicing his art blindfolded. I attended upon nobles and their families. I cast nativities for newborn princes, calculating which hours would be most auspicious for baptism. I advised on journeys, on marriages, on the best times to commence treatments. When the Queen fell ill with a quartan fever in the winter of 1345, I was one of 3 physicians who attended her, and I insisted that any bloodletting be postponed until the moon had passed out of Pisces, for the moon governed moisture, and Pisces was a watery sign, and to bleed her while the moon occupied this position might drain too much vital fluid. She recovered. The king himself thanked me, pressing a purse of silver into my hands. "You have served us well, master physician," he said. "We would have you remain in our household." I bowed low, my heart swelling with pride. I had reached the pinnacle of my profession, I was trusted with the health of the realm's most exalted persons. My knowledge of the heavens had proven its worth. How could I have known that all this certainty, all this carefully constructed understanding, would soon crumble like a manuscript left out in the rain? The first rumours reached England in the spring of 1347. Ships from the east brought news of a great affliction sweeping through the lands of the Cathay and the domains of the Turk. Entire cities had been emptied. The roads were choked with those fleeing, though there was nowhere to flee to. The accounts varied wildly. Some spoke of earthquakes that released poisonous vapours from the earth's depths, others of a rain of serpents, others of a mysterious miasma that killed within days of exposure. We physicians discussed these reports with professional interest but little alarm. Plagues had always existed. They rose and fell according to the configurations of the heavens. The great Albumassar had written that conjunctions of the superior planets in the watery signs brought forth pestilence, and when we calculated the positions, we found that indeed Saturn and Jupiter had recently conjoined in Aquarius. This explained everything. The affliction was astrologically determined, which meant it was also astrologically predictable, and, to some degree, astrologically preventable. Master Gilbert composed a treatise on the subject, which circulated among the learned. He argued that those whose natal charts showed strong positions for Jupiter and the Sun would likely be protected, while those under the domination of Saturn and Mars would be vulnerable. He recommended prophylactic measures, avoiding bloodletting during the conjunction's influence, consuming warming foods to counter the cold wetness of Aquarius, and wearing amulets inscribed with beneficial astrological symbols. I read his treatise and found it sound. I prepared similar recommendations for my own patients. The court physicians met and agreed that the affliction, whatever its ultimate cause, operated through astrological mechanisms and would therefore respond to astrological countermeasures. We were quite confident. We had centuries of accumulated learning behind us. We understood the principles by which celestial influences affected the sublunary realm. We knew our craft. In the summer of 1348, the Great Shadow crossed into France. The reports from across the Channel grew increasingly difficult to dismiss. The port cities of France, Marseille, Avignon, Rouen were in the grip of something unprecedented. The usual remedies seemed powerless. Physicians fled alongside everyone else. The Pope himself had retreated into sealed chambers at Avignon, sitting between two great fires that were kept burning night and day to purify the air. By autumn, it had reached the southern ports of England. Bristol was struck first, then Weymouth, then Southampton. The ships that brought it also brought terrified sailors who spoke of entire crews perishing within days of making port, of men who had been hale at dawn and were departed by vespers. The king ordered that I should investigate and report on the nature of the affliction. I travelled to Bristol in the company of Master John of Arderne and 2 other physicians, bearing letters of authority from the court. Nothing I had read, nothing I had studied, nothing I had been taught in all my years of learning had prepared me for what we found there. The city stank. Not the usual stench of middens and tanneries and crowded humanity, but something else, something that seemed to coat the back of the throat and linger in the nostrils, sweet and foul at once, like flowers rotting in standing water. The streets were not empty. The great emptying would come later, but they were wrong. People moved too quickly or too slowly. Doors were marked with crosses. Carts moved through the narrow ways carrying those who had succumbed, wrapped in shrouds or simply piled like cordwood. We were taken to a house where a merchant and his family lay afflicted. The merchant's wife admitted us, her face pale and set. She led us up narrow stairs to a chamber where 3 bodies lay on straw pallets. I've seen the passing many times in my life. I was accustomed to the pale faces, the laboured breathing, the gradual fading of the vital forces. This was different. The first body belonged to a man of perhaps 30 years. His face was flushed and twisted with pain, but it was his neck that drew our attention. Great swellings bulged beneath his jaw and in his armpits, black and purple like rotten fruit. The flesh around these swellings was discoloured, and there were patches dark as wine stains scattered across his arms and chest. Master John bent close, examining the swellings. "Buboes," he murmured. "I have read of such manifestations in the old texts, but never seen them so pronounced." The man's eyes were open but unseeing. His breath came in short, rattling gasps. As we watched, he convulsed once violently and then was still. The final quiet came that suddenly, with no gradual transition, no gentle fading. One moment struggling for breath, the next gone. The second body was a girl child, no more than 8 years old. The same swellings, the same dark patches, but she had also vomited dark matter onto the straw beside her palate. Blood, I realized, or what had been blood before whatever force drove this affliction had corrupted it into something else. The third body, the merchant himself, was not yet fully claimed. He thrashed and muttered, his skin burning with fever. When I touched his wrist to feel the pulse, the heat was immense, as though coals burned beneath his skin. The pulse itself was rapid and thready, barely perceptible. "We must bleed him," Master John said. "Clearly there is an excess of hot humours. The fever indicates an imbalance of yellow bile, aggravated by—" "Look at the marks," I interrupted. "Those dark patches. That is blood beneath the skin, forced there by—" I hesitated, searching for the mechanism. "By the violence of the imbalance. If we bleed him further, we may hasten his passage." We argued in low voices while the merchant thrashed and the widow stood in the doorway, silent and hollow-eyed. Finally we agreed to bleed him, but only lightly, and to administer cooling herbs to counter the fever. It made no difference. By the following morning, he too had passed. We returned to Oxford, where I had left my books and instruments. The other physicians dispersed to their own homes and practices. We had agreed to each study the affliction from our own learned perspectives, and to meet again to share our conclusions. I set up my astrolabe in my chamber and began to calculate. The conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter in Aquarius had occurred in March of 1345, 3 years before the shadow reached England. This was the primary cause, I felt certain. But there had to be secondary factors, triggering mechanisms that transformed a general astrological influence into this specific and terrible manifestation. I worked through the nights, consulting my ephemerides, casting charts for the major cities where the affliction had struck, looking for patterns. There, a conjunction of Mars and Saturn in January of 1348, occurring in the 10th degree of Aquarius, precisely the same degree where the Great Conjunction had occurred. Mars, planet of fire and violence, combining with Saturn, planet of cold and melancholy in a watery sign. This created a configuration of extraordinary malignity, a crossing of contrary influences that would corrupt the very air itself. And the moon, yes, the moon had been eclipsed 3 times during 1348, each eclipse occurring in signs that governed vital organs. The March eclipse in Libra, governing the kidneys and blood. The July eclipse in Capricorn, governing the bones and the generative powers. The September eclipse in Pisces, governing the feet and the humours generally. It all fit. The astrological testimony was clear and damning. The heavens themselves had conspired to create this affliction, layering malign influence upon malign influence until the very fabric of the sublunary realm was corrupted. I wrote a treatise explaining these findings. I detailed the astrological causes, the mechanisms by which celestial influences had corrupted the air and generated poisonous vapours. I prescribed remedies: avoidance of bloodletting during certain lunar phases, consumption of theriac and other compound medicines, fumigation of homes with aromatic herbs to purify the contaminated air, and most importantly prayer and penance, for such a configuration of the heavens clearly indicated divine displeasure. My treatise was copied and circulated. Other physicians wrote similar works, each detailing their own calculations and recommendations. The learned agreed. This was an astrologically driven affliction of unprecedented scale, but it could be understood and therefore could be managed according to established principles. How small we must have seemed to the indifferent stars, scurrying about with our charts and calculations, our desperate attempts to impose order on chaos, our certainty that we understood forces that we had barely begun to glimpse. The winter of 1348 brought no respite. The great shadow moved north and east, consuming village after village, town after town. London was struck in November. By January, it had reached as far as York. The king commanded that I should attend upon the court, which had retreated to Windsor. Gatherings were restricted, strangers were turned away. Letters arrived daily with news of fresh outbreaks, fresh casualties. Half the clergy of Canterbury had perished. The Bishop of Bath and Wells was gone. the Abbot of Westminster. The numbers grew too large to comprehend. I did what I could. I advised on fumigations and prophylactic measures. I cast charts to determine which members of the court were most vulnerable and should therefore take extra precautions. I prepared medicines according to the proper astrological hours, timing each preparation to coincide with beneficent planetary positions. Some of those I attended survived, others did not. I could discern no pattern save one. The affliction seemed to respect neither rank nor virtue nor medical learning. It took the young and the old, the robust and the frail, the pious and the dissolute with equal appetite. Master John of Ardern developed a theory that the affliction entered through the eyes, carried by the poisoned air. He recommended that people avoid looking directly at those who showed signs of affliction, that they should shield their faces and breathe only through cloths soaked in vinegar. Master Gilbert maintained that the astrological moment of first exposure determined the severity of the affliction. Those exposed during inauspicious planetary hours would succumb more quickly than those exposed when Jupiter or Venus were well placed. I found myself doubting both theories, though I could not articulate why. Something about the affliction seemed to mock our learning, to demonstrate the inadequacy of our carefully constructed frameworks. One night in March of 1349, I stood in the courtyard of Windsor Castle looking up at the stars. They wheeled overhead in their eternal courses, indifferent and beautiful. Mars glowed red near the horizon. Jupiter shone bright and steady in the south. Saturn, invisible in the glare of the sun, lurked somewhere in the constellation of Taurus. These were the same stars that had guided mariners across unknown seas, that had measured the seasons for farmers, that had marked the births of prophets and the falls of kingdoms. I had devoted my life to understanding their language, to interpreting their testimony, and yet the shadow continued its work, unstoppable and incomprehensible. Could you tell a man's fate from the trembling of a flame? I no longer knew. I no longer knew anything with the certainty I had once felt. In May of 1349, I received word that the monastery at Reading, where I had first learned my letters and first encountered the great books of medicine, was in desperate need. The affliction had struck there with particular severity. Half the brothers had already passed. The abbot begged for any physician who could offer assistance. I requested leave from the court and travelled back to Reading, to the place where my education had begun, carrying my instruments and medicines and the tattered remnants of my confidence. The monastery I remembered as a place of light and learning had become a house of the shadow. The chapel services continued, but with a quarter of the voices that had once lifted in prayer. The library was closed, for the brother who had kept it was among the departed. The herb garden, which had always been so carefully tended, had gone to seed. Brother Benedict, who had taught me astronomy so many years before, still lived. He was elderly now, his back bent and his hands tremulous, but his mind remained sharp. He greeted me in the cloister, embracing me despite the fear of contagion that had turned brother against brother, family member against family member. "You have come back," he said simply. "I have come to help if I can." He smiled sadly. "Can you help, my son? Can anyone?" I had no answer for him. Instead, I asked to see the afflicted. They had been isolated in a separate building, away from the main monastery. 8 brothers lay there on straw pallets in various stages of the affliction. Some were newly struck, still lucid and aware. Others were deep in fever, muttering and thrashing. 2 were already gone, their vessels left behind awaiting burial. I examined each one, taking note of symptoms, measuring pulses, consulting my charts to determine the astrological factors at work. And as I worked, Brother Benedict watched me with an expression I could not quite interpret. When I had finished my examinations and prescribed what remedies I could, he led me to the chapel. We sat together in the empty choir, surrounded by the carved stalls where generations of monks had chanted the divine office. "You are troubled," he said. It was not a question. "I do not understand," I admitted. "I have studied for decades. I can calculate the positions of the planets to the minute of arc. I know which herbs correspond to which planetary influences, which days are favourable for treatments, which hours are malign. And yet this affliction, it mocks all learning. It respects no rules that I can discern. Brother Benedict was silent for a long moment. "Perhaps," he said finally, "the rules we have discerned are not as fixed as we believed. But the stars are very far away," he said gently, "and we are very small." I wanted to argue. I wanted to defend the edifice of learning that I had spent my life constructing, but the words would not come. "I will tell you something," Brother Benedict continued. "When I was young, younger even than you were when you came to us, I believed that God's design was transparent, that if I studied diligently enough, if I prayed fervently enough, I would come to understand the pattern. The divine plan would reveal itself to me like a page turning in a book." He paused, his eyes distant. "I am old now, and I no longer believe that. I think the pattern, if there is one, is too vast for us to comprehend. We see fragments, pieces, and we construct from these pieces what we hope is truth. But it may be only our truth, our small human truth, and not the truth of heaven." "Then what use is learning?" I asked, hearing the bitterness in my own voice. "What use are all these books, all these calculations, if they cannot help us when we need them most?" "I did not say they were useless," Brother Benedict replied. "Only that they are not complete. Perhaps they were never meant to be complete. Perhaps we are meant to walk in twilight, seeing partially, understanding dimly, doing what good we can with the small lights we carry." We sat in silence as the shadows lengthened across the chapel floor. Outside, in the burial ground, I could hear the sound of spades biting into earth, more graves being prepared. I remained at the monastery for 2 months, tending the afflicted as best I could. Some recovered, whether due to my ministrations or despite them I could not say. Most did not. Brother Benedict himself was struck in June. I attended him personally, administering all the remedies I knew, timing every treatment to the most auspicious astrological moments. He passed on the feast of St. John the Baptist, as the sun stood at its highest point in the heavens. I held his hand as the final quiet came, and I wondered what he saw in those last moments, whether the divine pattern he had spoken of revealed itself at the end, or whether there was only darkness and then nothing at all. I buried him in the monastery garden, beneath the oak tree where we had once sat discussing the movements of the celestial spheres. The earth was heavy and damp, and my hands blistered on the spade's handle, and I thought that this physical labour, this sweating and straining, was perhaps more honest than all my years of chart casting and planetary calculation. When I returned to court in August, I found that the shadow had visited there as well in my absence. 2 of the king's daughters had been struck, though both had survived. Several courtiers were gone. The royal household had retreated further, fragmenting across different locations to reduce the risk of contagion. I was no longer summoned for consultations as frequently as before. Other physicians, I learned, had begun to question the purely astrological approach. Some argued that the affliction spread through direct contact, from person to person, regardless of planetary configurations. Others suggested that it originated from corrupt matter in the earth itself, stirred up by seismic activity. I found myself unable to disagree with them, though I also could not fully agree. The truth seemed to lie somewhere beyond the reach of any single theory, any single system of understanding. In the autumn of 1349, I returned to Oxford. The university had been devastated. Whole colleges had been emptied. The lecture halls stood silent. Of the physicians and natural philosophers I had known, fewer than half remained. I locked myself in my study and began to review everything I had learned, everything I had believed. I spread my charts across the table, laid out my volumes of Ptolemy and Albumassar and Avicenna. I recalculated the malign conjunctions, rechecked my interpretations of the eclipses, verified my understanding of planetary influences. The mathematics was correct. The logic was sound. According to every principle I had been taught, my conclusions should have been valid, and yet they had failed. Not partially, not marginally, but catastrophically. The affliction had not behaved as astrological theory predicted it should. Its patterns of spread, its selection of victims, its resistance to treatments administered at propitious hours, all of it contradicted what should have occurred. Where, then, was the flaw? In my calculations, in the underlying theory, in the very assumption that the stars governed earthly affairs in the deterministic manner we had always believed. I thought of Brother Benedict's words, "We see fragments, pieces, and we construct from these pieces what we hope is truth. Perhaps that was all we had ever done, constructed hopeful truths from partial observations, mistaking the map for the territory, the model for reality itself. I began to write, not a treatise for other physicians, but a private confession, a document for myself alone, attempting to trace where my certainty had transformed into doubt. The stars, I wrote, were still beautiful. They still wheeled overhead in their ordained courses. But perhaps their influence on human affairs was more subtle, more complex than our crude theories allowed. Perhaps the great celestial machine was not the direct cause of earthly events, but merely one factor among many, and we had elevated it above all others because it was what we could measure and predict. Or perhaps, and this thought brought a chill even in the warmth of my study, perhaps the stars were not concerned with us at all. Perhaps they moved through their orbits for reasons entirely their own, and we suffered and thrived and passed away in patterns that had nothing to do with planetary aspects or lunar phases, patterns that emerged from causes too numerous and interwoven for any human mind to trace. Would you have trusted the stars, as I once did? I am no longer certain I can trust them, not in the way I once did, with absolute confidence, with the certainty that knowing their positions was equivalent to knowing truth. The great shadow began to recede in 1350, though it would return in lesser waves throughout the following years. The initial catastrophe, however, was over. England had been transformed. Whole villages stood empty. Fields went unploughed for lack of hands to work them. The social order that had seemed so fixed, so ordained by divine and celestial law, began to crack and shift. I continued to practice medicine, but with a changed approach. I still consulted my charts, still timed certain treatments to favourable hours, but I also observed more carefully what actually occurred, rather than what the theory said should occur. I learned from failures as much as from successes. I acknowledged uncertainty where before I had projected confidence. Some of my patients found this new humility disturbing. They wanted a physician who spoke with authority, who promised that the stars guaranteed their recovery. Others, particularly those who had survived the shadow, seemed to appreciate honesty more than certainty. Master Gilbert Keimer, who had written so confidently about astrological prophylaxis, had not survived. Ironically, or perhaps inevitably, he had been struck down in the first wave, despite all his careful calculations and precautions. Master John of Ardern survived and continued to practice his surgical arts with skill, but he too had grown quieter, less certain in his pronouncements. In 1351, I was invited to participate in a consultation of physicians at the King's command, to compile a comprehensive account of the shadow and recommendations for responding to any future outbreak. We gathered at Windsor, a dozen learned men who had all survived what so many had not. We debated for 3 days. Some insisted that the purely astrological explanation must be maintained, that any failures were due to inadequate understanding of celestial mechanics, rather than flaws in the theory itself. Others argued for a purely material explanation: poisonous vapours, corrupt matter, contagious miasmas that spread from person to person without celestial mediation. I found myself arguing for a middle position, though even as I spoke, I felt the inadequacy of my words. Perhaps, I suggested, the heavens establish general conditions, seasons of greater or lesser vulnerability, but the specific mechanisms operate through more immediate causes. A farmer does not plant seed in winter, not because the stars forbid it, but because the earth is frozen. The stars mark the season, but the earth determines what grows. It was an imperfect analogy, and I knew it. But it was the closest I could come to expressing what I had begun to feel. That we had confused correlation with causation, pattern with purpose, that our elaborate astrological theories were descriptive rather than explanatory, maps rather than mechanisms. The final document we produced was a compromise that satisfied no one completely. It acknowledged astrological factors as contributing causes, but recommended practical measures: isolation of the afflicted, fumigation of houses, improved cleanliness, that could be implemented without reference to planetary positions. The king thanked us for our labours and gave us each a purse of gold. As we departed, I heard one of the younger physicians murmur to his companion. "They understand nothing. They have learned nothing." Perhaps he was right. Or perhaps we had learned something, though not what we had expected to learn. We had learned the limits of our learning, the boundaries beyond which our carefully constructed systems could not pass. Life continued, as it always does, with the stubborn persistence of grass pushing through cobblestones. The fields were replanted. The empty houses were occupied by new families. The churches that had lost their priests found new clergy, often men less educated than their predecessors, but no less sincere. I grew older. My sight began to fail, making it difficult to read the fine print in my volumes of astronomy. My hands, once steady enough to manipulate delicate instruments, developed a tremor that made precise measurements challenging. I took fewer patients. I spent more time in contemplation, walking the fields around Oxford, watching the seasons turn. Spring always came, regardless of planetary configurations. The swallows returned from the south at appointed times that had nothing to do with my calculations. The oak trees budded and leafed and dropped their acorns according to rhythms that predated human observation. One evening in the summer of 1352, the year in which I now write these words, I stood again beneath the stars, as I had done as a boy in my father's fields, as I had done countless times throughout my life. Mars was rising in the east, red and bright. Jupiter hung in the southern sky, its steady light unchanged by all the suffering that had occurred beneath its gaze. I tried to feel what I had once felt, that sense of connection, of participation in a grand design, of understanding something vast and important. But the feeling would not come. The stars were simply there, beautiful and distant, moving through their courses for reasons I would never know. And yet, and this surprised me, I felt a kind of peace. Not the peace of certainty, but something else. The peace of acceptance, perhaps. The peace of knowing that I did not know, and that this not knowing was itself a kind of truth. I think often of Brother Benedict, of his words about walking in twilight with small lights. I understand now what he meant in a way I could not when he first spoke them. We do carry lights, the accumulated learning of generations, the careful observations, the theories and models and systems that help us navigate the darkness. These lights are real and valuable. They illuminate small portions of the vast mystery that surrounds us, but they are not the sun. They do not reveal everything, and when we mistake them for complete illumination, when we convince ourselves that our small circle of light encompasses all that exists, we commit a kind of blindness more profound than simple ignorance. I still practice medicine, though I am now more often consulted than consulting. Young physicians come to me, eager and confident, and I see in their eyes the certainty I once possessed. Sometimes I try to temper that certainty with caution. More often I simply listen and nod, and let them make their own journey toward doubt. For doubt, I have come to believe, is not the opposite of faith, but rather its companion. Certainty is the enemy of both. Certainty closes doors, ends questions, pronounces judgment, and moves on. Doubt keeps doors open, allows for revision, acknowledges complexity. The stars taught me doubt, though it took me decades to hear their lesson. They are still there, still beautiful, still moving in their appointed courses. I still observe them, still note their positions, still feel a kind of awe when I contemplate the mathematical elegance of their motions. But I no longer believe they govern human fate in the simple, mechanical way I once thought. If they influence us at all, and perhaps they do, though not as I imagined it is through pathways too subtle and complex for our crude instruments to measure. What, then, does it mean to heal? I have asked myself this question countless times in the years since the shadow passed. If my knowledge is incomplete, if my theories are flawed, if my certainty was misplaced, what use am I? What use is any physician who admits that he walks in twilight, seeing partially, understanding dimly? I think the answer lies not in grand theories or celestial mechanics, but in smaller truths. When I sit beside a fevered patient, holding a cool cloth to their forehead, I am present. When I prepare a remedy, even if I no longer fully believe in the astrological timing, I'm caring. When I speak words of comfort, even if I cannot promise recovery, I am acknowledging the reality of suffering. These small acts may accomplish more than all my elaborate calculations ever did. They may be, in fact, the true heart of healing, not the restoration of perfect balance according to theoretical principles, but the simple act of accompanying another person through their affliction, bearing witness to their pain, offering whatever small comfort can be given. I think of all the people I attended during the shadow years. So many passed, despite everything I tried, and yet, for some of them, perhaps my presence mattered. Perhaps the fact that I stayed, that I did not flee, that I attempted to help even when help seemed futile, perhaps that meant something. Not cure, but care. Not mastery, but companionship. Not certainty, but presence. These are smaller ambitions than I held in my youth when I dreamed of commanding the forces that governed health and affliction. But they may be more honest ambitions, and perhaps, in the end, more valuable. And so I write this confession, this testament, this account of a life spent pursuing certainty and finding instead a deeper kind of truth. I was wrong about many things. I believed the stars governed human fate with mechanical precision. I believed that sufficient learning could unlock all mysteries. I believed that the pattern was there to be found, clear and complete, if only I studied diligently enough. I was wrong, and yet I do not count my life wasted. The journey toward understanding, even when it leads to the acknowledgement of not understanding, has value. The questions matter, even when the answers prove elusive. To those who may read this in times to come, if anyone reads it at all, I offer this. Be wary of certainty. Be suspicious of any system that claims to explain everything. The universe is more complex, more subtle, more strange than any theory can encompass. But do not despair of learning. Do not abandon the pursuit of understanding, simply because complete understanding proves impossible. Walk in twilight with whatever light you can carry. Observe carefully. Question deeply. And when you encounter the limits of your knowledge, acknowledge them honestly rather than disguising them with elaborate theorizing. Above all, remember that behind every theory, every system, every grand explanation, there are individual human beings who suffer and hope and fear. Do not become so enamored of your intellectual constructs that you forget the reality they were meant to serve. The autumn advances. The leaves are turning gold and brown, preparing to fall as they have every autumn since the world was made. My candle burns low, and I've nearly reached the end of this parchment. I look back across my life and see a pattern. Not the pattern I expected, not the orderly progression from ignorance to knowledge that I anticipated, but something else. A spiral, perhaps, circling around and around the same central mystery, approaching it from different angles but never quite reaching the center. The mystery remains. Why do we suffer? Why does affliction strike one person and spare another? What forces truly govern health and sickness, life and the final quiet? I do not know. I know less in some ways than I did at the beginning. But I know one thing with certainty, a strange certainty, a paradoxical certainty that embraces doubt rather than denying it. I know that the question matters more than the answer. I know that the seeking matters more than the finding. I know that walking in twilight with small lights is better than sitting in darkness claiming to possess the sun. The stars wheel overhead. Mars and Jupiter and Saturn continue their ancient dance. The moon waxes and wanes. The sun rises and sets. And beneath these vast, indifferent movements, we small creatures make our small meanings, carry our small lights, offer our small comforts to one another. It is enough. It must be enough. It is all we have. Would you have trusted the stars as I once did? Would you have built your life upon a foundation of celestial certainty, only to feel that foundation crumble when reality refused to conform to theory? Perhaps you already have. Perhaps you trust in something now with the same absolute confidence I once brought to my astrological charts. Perhaps you believe you understand forces that govern your world, that you have grasped the pattern, that you possess the key to some essential mystery. I do not tell you that you are wrong. I do not know whether you are wrong. I only tell you this: hold your certainty lightly. Be prepared for it to transform into something else, into doubt, perhaps, or into a more nuanced understanding that encompasses uncertainty rather than denying it. The light falls differently now than it did when I was young. It slants through the shutters at a gentler angle, speaks of endings rather than beginnings. My hand trembles as I write these final words, and soon I will set down my pen and rest. I've tried to tell you truly what I saw and felt and learned. I've tried to honour the memory of those who trusted me, even when my trust in my own learning proved misplaced. I have tried to trace the path from certainty to doubt, to whatever lies beyond both certainty and doubt. The candle gutters, the shadows lengthen. Outside, in the gathering dark, the first stars are beginning to appear. They are very beautiful. They are very far away. And they are, I think, exactly what they are, neither more nor less. Not governors of fate, not indifferent mechanics, not symbols or signs or portents. Simply stars, burning in the darkness, marking time and distance and the vast indifference of space. I have spent my life trying to read their language. Now, at the end, I wonder if they were ever speaking to us at all, or if, perhaps, the real language we needed to learn was not written in the heavens, but in the faces of those we tried to heal, in the courage of those who suffered, in the small acts of compassion that sustained us through the shadow years. Perhaps that was the true astronomy all along, not the study of distant lights, but the study of the light we carry within us, small and flickering though it may be. I set down my pen. The work is finished. What I have written, I have written. Let it stand as testament to one man's journey from certainty through doubt towards something I cannot quite name, some understanding that includes both knowledge and ignorance, both faith and skepticism, both the longing for pattern and the acceptance of chaos. The stars continue their dance. Mars rises, Jupiter sets, Saturn, invisible in the glare of the setting sun, lurks somewhere beyond the edge of sight. And here, in this small room, in this moment, balanced between day and night, between knowledge and ignorance, between life and whatever lies beyond, here I rest. The heavens were not silent, but neither were they speaking the language I thought I understood. Perhaps that is the final lesson. Perhaps that is enough. Here ends the confession of a physician who lived through the Great Shadow and emerged with more questions than answers, written in the 43rd year of King Edward III's reign, in the autumn of 1352, when the light grows thin and memory grows long. May those who read this forgive the errors of a man who meant well but understood little. May God have mercy on all who suffered while I pretended to knowledge I did not possess. And may the stars, indifferent as they are, continue their eternal dance above the small stage where we act out our brief dramas of hope and fear and understanding. Amen.